Hello and welcome to the Regulation Asia video series. I'm Nick Wakefield, co-founder of Regulation Asia. Now, back in November 2022, we hosted the Regulation Asia Awards for Excellence, and we're delighted to give out an award to Droit for digital regulatory reporting. I'm pleased to welcome back Brock Arnason, CEO of Droit, who joins me today for this exclusive interview. Welcome, Brock.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
Excellent. So our focus for today's conversation is on ensuring firms are future-proofing regulatory reporting in light of the various rewrites and refits. So let's dive straight in. Given the goal of achieving global harmonization of derivatives reporting requirements, can you talk a bit about the alignment between the CFTC and EMIR regimes, as well as those in the major APAC jurisdictions?
Certainly. So I think there are a couple of elements to this. The first and most obvious is that regulators are updating their reporting field requirements to align with the so-called critical data elements, or CDE, defined by CPMI IOSCO. Additionally, the majority of regulators from the US, EU, UK, and Asia Pacific have chosen to adopt what's known as the ISO 20022 and UPI, or Unique Product Identifier Standards. So there's still a little bit of lack of standardization in the field name conventions, which makes it difficult for firms to easily identify what fields are common or bespoke across jurisdictions. And regulators are occasionally applying different rules or requirements for the same field. But overall, the intent is to align on the structure of what's being reported, the specific elements that should be reported, and the definition of products, so that there is a sort of uniformity across the different reporting regimes.
Can you talk a bit then about the burden that is actually falling on financial institutions here, and how adequate are current trade reporting processes, the architecture, and reconciliation approaches for the new reporting requirements, and how significant are the systems and operational changes?
So in general, regulatory reporting is complex. It's difficult to get perfectly correct, yet somewhat ironically, it's one of the most enforced areas of regulation. I think partly because it's the one that regulators have the most transparency and visibility into. There are a lot of technical challenges and hurdles for firms to overcome. So you have different reportable fields per jurisdiction, per asset class, per product. You have different reporting formats, different trade repositories, ARMS, APAs that you need to submit to. And then there are controls that you require to ensure that those systems have been implemented correctly. So if you think about this, there are really a couple of different areas. There is what I would call correctness and completeness of reporting. So the completeness of reporting, or comprehensiveness of reporting, relates to what we would call reporting eligibility, the determination as to whether there is a particular requirement to report, who bears that requirement. The correctness of the report is the nature of exactly what was populated in what field. And then there is the timeliness of the reporting as well. The timeliness is something that is observed by regulators who have small windows that they require something to be reported in. So we see that many clients have fragmentation across their origination systems. So if you have trade booking systems that are different across asset classes and products, there is fragmentation as to how the data from those systems gets fed down into the source system you're using for reporting. That can make it difficult to adapt systems to new reporting requirements. And then there's a reconciliation process, both between the point of reporting and the actual reporting venues, and between the point of reporting and the trading systems. And indeed, many institutions are now instituting original system directly to repository reporting reconciliation. So there's a huge number of moving parts and things to consider.
Okay, so what particular areas of the changes do you see then as most burdensome from a systems and technical perspective, and how is Droit helping firms respond to that?
So if we go back to this sort of architecture that I've laid out, you can see where there might be a large number of significant problems in adapting that infrastructure to some of these new standards. So one of those is in the way that you would think about generating ISO 20022 messages. So convergence to that standard will be beneficial to firms in the long run, as regulators can then articulate their reporting requirements as XSDs, as these schema documents. But in the short term, many firms have FPML or CSV-based reporting mechanisms that are going to need to be updated. They'll have a need to be able to reproduce their legacy system reporting formats, and they'll want to modify these primary systems to generate the new reports. We help firms with a couple of different areas. So eligibility, as I mentioned, this determination that you are subject to a reporting requirement. And then there is either validation or generation of the report. So the way to think about the difference there is validation is a third party or secondary control on a message that you've already generated as your primary reporting mechanism. And the purpose of that is to check your homework on the interpretation of the rules, on the specific format of what is being reported. Clients use us frequently to validate those shippable messages as a secondary QA check. They can also use us as a primary to generate that originating message. Similarly, for eligibility, we are either used as a secondary control to validate the comprehensiveness of the reporting, right? In other words, is this being correctly reported? Have we missed anything? And we're also used to drive primary decisions there. So it really depends on the nature of what is desired. Is the important thing to put in place a control infrastructure for a primary process that you are largely satisfied with so that you understand how to benchmark that to a consensus? Or is the goal to replace a primary process with something that is a bit more traceable? It depends on the nature of the problem.
Okay, so you referenced UPIs earlier. This is obviously seen as a major change. How do you see this impacting how reporting regimes operate moving forward?
So I think to understand UPI, you need to first think about what is being used in the absence of UPI. So you have to have some common way of classifying a product. And many of the ways in which people are classifying products relate to the fields that describe that product. But there's also a somewhat consolidated attempt in different regulatory regimes to describe products. So for example, there's something called the ISDA product taxonomy. There's a CFI, or classification of financial instruments, and there are, of course, ISINs themselves. Each of these is used in different regimes to taxonomize and classify product types. Now, CFI and ISDA product taxonomies are a bit broad and sometimes inconsistent, whereas ISINs are too granular for products that don't map to a sort of straightforward security master representation. The industry sees UPI as a solution to this problem, to consolidate across these different product taxonomies, to define codes, to rationalize inconsistent definitions of notional price, deliverable currency, etc. Now, although the majority of regulators have chosen to adopt UPI as part of their reporting requirements, that strategy varies by regulator. For EMIR, for example, UPI is required if the trade doesn't already have an ISIN. For the CFTC regimes, the UPI is always required. Firms will need to define a process to generate and back report UPI historically, which can also be challenging. A secondary challenge with UPI is there is an infrastructure provider known as NADSB that's the sole provider of this data. Some firms who have already integrated with them to generate consolidated identifiers from MIR and EMIR reporting won't be impacted, but those who have not will find that that's a bit of a lift to build that integration.
Okay, so What recommendations do you have then for firms that are reporting in multiple jurisdictions, looking to minimize that duplication of system enhancements and to obviously future-proof themselves against the future regulatory changes?
So I would say a couple of best practice suggestions and perhaps a warning. So best practice suggestion for architecture is everyone has some form of fragmentation in their origination systems for booking. It's important to ensure that there is some form of a centralized place that data flows, a data lake, if you will, from which the points of reporting can draw information in a consolidated basis. So that's a clear recommendation. That's best practice. The second recommendation is to use a system where you can actually get an understanding of the evolving consensus interpretation of regulations as they change. There's a lot of change coming over the next year, 18 months or so. And it's important to understand where there's ambiguity in interpretation, where vendors in particular who are providing reporting repository services are interpreting these regulations and adding their own requirements to them, that there is a form of understanding as you go into testing processes for these different regimes. So for that purpose, you need something that benchmarks to an industry consensus. Droit obviously serves a role here as a secondary control or as a primary that can actually drive that reporting. So I would say make sure that someone is marking your homework, so to speak, as you make all of the changes to update your infrastructure. Try to have best practices for consolidating and minimizing fragmentation as much as possible. And finally, be advised that although these different regimes are trying to consolidate what is being reported in terms of a common set of fields, there are nuances in the interpretation of what those fields mean for each regime. So keep that in mind.
Okay, great way to wrap up there. So really appreciate you spending the time with us today to walk through those changes and taking place in the derivatives reporting space, both globally and across APAC. If you want to continue the conversation, please do reach out to Droit, who I'm sure will be very happy to share further insights. And you can always keep up to date with the latest developments on Regulation Asia across our news, features, interviews, and our video and podcast series. So Brock, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you all for watching.
Thank you.